What we want to do in this video is we want to take a look at the efficiency of competitive markets. We want to use consumer surplus and producer surplus to really think about whether or not a free market is a good thing compared to other ways of organizing economic activity. So we've got consumer and producer surplus. Let's think about what our objective is going to be here. Our goal is going to be to maximize the economic well-being of buyers and sellers. Okay? And so first we need to make sure that we're clear that what we're talking about here is economic well-being. There may be other ways of defining well-being that are worth talking about. There are, but what we want to do right now is talk about economic well-being. Okay? Essentially, we're going to think about the well-being of buyers, the well-being of sellers. We're going to add that together, and we're going to define what we call total surplus. So total surplus is just going to be consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay? We know what each of these things look like. It's the area under the demand curve and above the price. This is the area under the price and above the supply curve. Sometimes this is known as economic surplus. So you may hear me, I try in this class to just call it total surplus, but sometimes I'll slip up and call it economic surplus. They mean the same thing. So now let's think about what total surplus looks like. I'm usually going to abbreviate total surplus TS. Okay? So let's draw a picture of our demand curve and our supply curve. So here's our demand curve, here's our supply curve. Total surplus, I'm not going to put the price on here, but if we had the market determined price, it would be right there. This area up here would be consumer surplus, and this area down here would be total or producer surplus. We're not going to worry about which is which. This is going to be total surplus. So total surplus is the area under the demand curve and above the supply curve. It's got to be both of those at the same time. There's a lot of more area that's under the demand curve, but it needs to be both under the demand curve and above the supply curve. Okay? So you can see right now that as big as total surplus can be is this triangle right here, just from a geometric point of view. There's other area that's above the supply curve out here, but that's not under the demand curve. Okay? So there's our definition of total surplus. Our goal is going to be to think about how to maximize total surplus in the market. We're not interested in putting, at this point, consumers on a different level than producers. If I were to ask most students, what do you identify with, being a consumer or producer, most students, most people identify with being consumers. Most people consider themselves a consumer. But you have to think about the fact that you're also a producer. If anytime you're working at a job, you are a producer. You're selling your labor. So all of us are both consumers and producers. Okay? So it's not the case that this just represents the firms. This represents anybody selling anything like their labor. Okay? So we're gonna just add up the well-being of buyers and the well-being of sellers, because all of us are both of them, and we're gonna think about how can we maximize just well-being of all of the people on both sides of this situation here. So our goal is to maximize total surplus. Maximize total surplus. We're going to talk about some allocations, different quantities that can be produced in a market, and we will say that any particular allocation is efficient if it maximizes total surplus. So when I say an allocation is efficient, then what I mean is that it maximizes total surplus. Okay? Any allocation, any outcome that does not maximize total surplus is not efficient. Now, let's think about the market equilibrium. Okay, let's think about how a market works. Let's talk about where everybody is in a market. If we put up here our demand curve and our supply curve. let's think about who's buying and who's selling. Now, we know that the price in a market, the price is determined not by the buyers or by the sellers. We're talking about a competitive market here. Neither the buyers nor the sellers have any control over price. Price emerges as a result of the interaction of the buyers and the sellers. Okay? Consumer surplus is up here, producer surplus is down there. But right now, let's talk about who's buying and who's not buying, who's selling and who's not selling. Now, we're going to be thinking in this section here about what's the right allocation, what's the right quantity to have produced. And let's start this conversation by thinking just conceptually about somebody that we're going to call a benevolent social planner. And the benevolent social planner is going to be some being that knows everything, can control anything, or can control everything, and wants everybody to be as well off as possible. And so the question we're going to ask, the conceptual question we're going to ask is, what would the benevolent social planner do? What quantity down here, out of all of these quantities that could be produced, what's the quantity the benevolent social planner would choose to have produced and consumed? And who would the benevolent social planner choose to have consume it and not consume it? Who would the benevolent social planner choose to produce it and not produce it? Let's think our way through that by thinking about what would happen if, let's suppose we're in a classroom and all of us take some trip on a plane and we crash on some deserted island, and there we are stuck. And we've got to decide who's going to engage in different jobs, right? And so let's suppose, since I'm leading the field trip, so let's suppose I'm in charge. We've got to decide who's going to go out and find water, who's going to go out and get some shelter, build something that we can get shelter in. Who's going to go out and find food for us to eat? Well, the way we've talked about that type of decision in a Principles of Macro class, you know that you tend to specialize. The gains from trade are biggest when people specialize in what they have the comparative advantage in. Well, if it's my job as the leader of the group to somehow decide who's going to do those jobs, I don't know what everybody has a comparative advantage in. And so it would be hard for me to figure out who should go do which jobs. We could just let everybody go out and do whatever they want, but our goal is to maximize total surplus, and so the size of the economic pie is not going to be as big as possible if everybody goes out and ends up not concentrating on the good for which or the job for which they have the comparative advantage. On the other hand, let's think about a different situation where maybe we have to allocate who gets a good and who doesn't. So think about, let's suppose we're all in a room and there's 40 of us, and I've got a big pizza with 40 slices. And we try to decide who's going to get a slice and maybe who's not. One way that we could allocate the slices of pizza is to give everybody a slice. But let's suppose that our goal is to make everybody as well off as possible. Well, if we give everybody a slice, then that probably means that I'm going to give a slice to somebody who doesn't really want a slice. Let's suppose there's somebody who doesn't like pizza, or somebody who's already eaten and they're not that interested in it. And if I do that, then I've misallocated the good. I've given a slice to somebody who didn't want it, and I've missed out on an opportunity to give it to somebody else who did want it. Let's make the problem even harder. Let's suppose there's 40 people in the room and there's only 20 slices of pizza. And now you have to decide who gets a slice and who doesn't. You got to look somebody in the eye and say, nope, you don't get one. Well, ideally, the way we would allocate it is to make sure that the people who value it the most get it, and the people who don't value it at all, we don't allocate any to them. Both of those decisions, the decision of who's going to produce a good and who's not, who's going to consume a good and who's not, the benevolent social planner would have no problem making those decisions in terms of who did the jobs and who consumed the good. Because the benevolent social planner would be able to look at the people and know how much they value a slice of pizza, and would allocate the pizza to the people who value it the most. The benevolent social planner would be able to look at a person and know what their comparative advantage is compared to the other people and have them do that job. So if our goal, let's suppose we've got a whole bunch of people here, little tiny people, and we've got to organize economic activity. We've got to make a decision about, should we organize economic activity with markets, allow people to buy and sell what they want within the bounds of the law, or should we go with a socialist outcome where the government makes the decisions about how much of each good's produced and who gets what? Or a communist outcome where, same thing, the government plans who's going to get it, who's not, who's going to produce it, how much is being produced. That's really what we're trying to figure out. Which of those outcomes would be better? Which would the benevolent social planner choose? Let's think about how a free market works. So actually, let's summarize what we just said. Benevolent social planner, I'm going to abbreviate BSP. Benevolent social planner, in order to maximize well-being, we just talked about the idea that the benevolent social planner would allocate the good to the people who value it the most. And lest you think that that means that only the rich get it, that's not what we're talking about here. The value you place on something is related to income, but it is not completely determined by income. Just if you go back to the guitar example, when we had the table of willingness to pay, your willingness to pay for something does not tell us your income. Okay? So the benevolent social planner would allocate the good to the people who value it the most and would allocate production to the most efficient producers. Allocate production to the most efficient producers. So now let's think about what the free market does. Let's think about who consumes and who doesn't consume, who produces and who doesn't produce. So here's the price. In terms of buyers, the buyers are represented along this portion of the demand curve. These people are the buyers. They choose to buy, not because the government told them they could or couldn't. They choose to buy because for these people, their willingness to pay is greater than the price. Here's the price. Here's their willingness to pay. They choose to buy the good. These people down here choose not to buy the good. These are what we're going to call our non-buyers. They choose not to buy it, again, not because the government told them they couldn't. They choose not to buy because their willingness to pay is less than the price. Right out here's the price. Here's how much they value it. Our producers are represented along this portion of the supply curve. These are the producers. Let's call them, let's say, sellers. And they choose to sell the good because they can sell it at a price that's higher than their cost of production. So they choose to sell because the market-determined price is higher than their cost of production. These people out here are the non-sellers. They choose not to sell, not because the government told them they couldn't, but because the price is less than their cost of production. Here's how much they can sell it for. Here's what it would cost them to produce the good. So notice that the buyers and the sellers are represented on this portion of the picture, and the non-buyers and non-sellers are represented on this portion of the picture. In a free market, that price signal causes the buyers and non-buyers, the sellers and non-sellers, to sort themselves voluntarily into two groups, those who buy and those who don't, those who sell and those who don't. Notice that the buyers are the people with the highest willingness to pay. The non-buyers have a low willingness to pay. The sellers are the most efficient sellers in a free market, and the non-sellers are the relatively inefficient people. So notice that the free market does the exact same thing in terms of what the benevolent social planner would do. That's not enough yet to say that the free market maximizes total surplus. What we have to do now is think about another picture. Let's think about the demand curve and the supply curve. Remember that the demand curve represents value and the supply curve represents cost of production. Here's the free market quantity. We want to think about what would happen if we chose a different quantity. So what if we're government planners and we just choose, remember we don't get to see this picture, what if we just choose this quantity, Q1, instead of Q? What's the problem with Q1 if we just stopped right there? Well, if we stop right there, we can go up to the supply curve and up to the demand curve to see at the margin how much people value it and how much the cost of production is. If we go up to the supply curve, we see that right there's the cost of production. I'm going to call it cost of production 1. At the margin for that quantity, there's how much it costs to produce that particular unit. If we go up to the demand curve, we can see how much consumers value it. There's willingness to pay at the margin. We'll call it willingness to pay 1. We see that at this quantity of Q1, willingness to pay is greater than the cost of production. The marginal benefit's bigger than the marginal cost. We shouldn't stop there. In terms of total surplus, you can see that if we stopped there, we would get this amount of total surplus, but we would miss out on this triangle right there. Any missed total surplus we call deadweight loss. So if we stopped at Q1, we would experience some deadweight loss. Or we could think about what happens if the government just decided to produce that quantity. What's wrong with Q2? Well, if we go up to the demand curve, we can see the value at the margin. There's willingness to pay, 2. And here's the cost of production at the margin, COP2. You can see this quantity is not a good quantity because at the margin it costs more than what people value it. Right? So the problem with this quantity is that willingness to pay at the margin is less than cost of production. The benevolent social planner would never stop here because we would miss out on this amount of total surplus. The benevolent social planner would never move production out to this point because we would also create deadweight loss out here. What quantity would the benevolent social planner choose? Well, that quantity. From a geometric point of view, that's the quantity that maximizes the area that's under the demand curve and above the supply curve. It maximizes well-being. From an economics point of view, in terms of the first equal marginal principle, which we'll talk about later on, what we see is that total surplus is maximized when marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. At that quantity, at the margin, willingness to pay is equal to the cost of production. This is the quantity that maximizes total surplus. So what we can say is the free market outcome ends up being the same outcome as what the benevolent social planner would choose. The same people are consuming and producing the good, those who value it the most, and the most efficient producers. And in terms of the quantity that gets produced, the benevolent social planner would choose the quantity that maximizes well-being, maximizes total surplus, and creates no deadweight loss. Any other quantity creates deadweight loss. So let's think about kind of a summary of what we're seeing here. Here's how you summarize kind of the market outcome and whether or not it's good. If we were planners, let's suppose we were government planners and we are deciding which quantity to produce. Here's the information we've got. Right there. Remember, as planners, we don't get to see the demand curve for every good and service and the supply curve for every good and service. So as a central planner, whether we're talking about communism or socialism, we just have to pick a quantity. Maybe we pick the same quantity that was produced last year. Let's pick that quantity. And we got to pick the quantity in this market, and we got to pick the quantity in lots of other markets. And the problem is, we don't know what the demand curve and the supply curve look like. So it could be that if we could see the demand curve and the supply curve, we would see that there's what they look like. And now we have chosen a quantity that results in not as much well-being as if we had chosen the free market quantity or allowed the free market to operate and result in that quantity. So the general conclusion that we can get is that the best a planned economy could hope for is to tie the free market. It can't beat it. The free market results in a maximization of total surplus. There's no other way of organizing economic activity that is better than that. Now, we have to talk about here at the end the fact that that does not mean free markets are perfect. There are times when the outcome of a free market is not the best possible outcome. Those are times when there's an externality present, whether it's a positive externality or a negative externality, or times when we're talking about a public good. And we don't have time to talk about those right now. We'll talk about them possibly later. But let me just leave you with the conclusion that we've just demonstrated that free markets are the best way to organize economic activity. They are not perfect, but that's the place we need to start. Central planning, the planners, regardless of how good their intentions are, do not have the information necessary to even get close to the amount of well-being that would be created with a free market. I'll see you in another video.